Hi everyone, Jim of Shiloh Kahal, and today I return to the series from Tim Hegg of TorahResource that he entitled Law versus Great, and I'm going into his third part. I just covered his second part and played his second part for viewing on my channel. But let me just also mention there is a first part that he entitles The Hebraic Roots the Hebraic background to the gospel, which is also very important. I'm not skipping it because it's not important. It's just that this is going to be very long already. And there's very good information in there because that has also been one of my contentions, and that is that to really, I never did in my early walk in the faith ever really understand. While I thought maybe I did, I never really understood the Hebraic background to the Gospels and the accounts of Yahushua and what really would have been taking place in the land. And it's very important. And so if you are interested in what Tim is saying in these two, the second and third parts up here that he has done, then it might be worth revisiting or going back and visiting his part one, and I'll try to put the links to all three of his videos in the videos that I'm doing here. So let me just also confirm before I get back into it, this is the work of Tim Hegg. Tim Hegg, I believe, is the founder of this entire organization that he calls TorahResource, and he's got the channel out there. And when he goes to his TorahResource channel, see, when you go to his TorahResource channel, he's one of the content creators, somebody putting information out there, but he's not the only one. And I would also just say, as a disclaimer, while Tim will identify with Messianic Judaism, or he's a Messianic Jew, if I don't want to misrepresent what he would call himself, but I believe he's a Messianic Jew. I know he's Messianic, and I think he would call himself a Messianic Jew, although he tends to refer to himself as just Messianic, as far as I can tell. While there are many things that he is sharing that I find information that confirms the type of information and the information that my searching has led me to, and the conclusions that my searching have led me to, much of his information affirms and confirms that. And that's one of the reasons why I am sharing this. But admittedly, as I said in the other part, there are some things that I would just want to distance myself from in terms of understanding, like his understanding of what Qumran is and the Essenes. I also will distance myself from his idea of what needs to be canonized in the scriptures, and I will separate and distance myself from the concepts of his name and restored name. Although I don't feel I do feel strongly about some of these topics, but these are not things that I would separate from Tim. They're just different conclusions to information we're both studying. But I highly value the work of Tim Hegg. I have enjoyed his humility. I've enjoyed his approach. And his scholarship. I just really appreciating Tim Hegg. So with that, let's get started in his third part that he's entitled Law versus Grace. But before I do, let me set the stage just a little bit here, because if you are just picking up this video, you're in part 3 and you would have missed part 2 of my series, but part 1 and 2 of his series, where he's really trying to establish what took place historically and how did we end up with this separation from what the early communities that Messiah came to, who understood Torah, were living in Torah, had a Torah-based understanding of things, and and that's what the early church would have been operating under, Torah, but not the condemnation of the Torah anymore, but Torah and the Messiah coming to their Torah-based communities, and how that grew out and amongst the Gentiles, and then things morphed as it went amongst the Gentiles, and we ended up with messaging that began to separate itself from its early moorings. Well, what's the history of that? How did that come to be? And what is grace? And what is Torah? What is law? These are all concepts and things that he's talking about. So he's going to be stepping in right in the midst of the conversation because he'd already done a presentation. So just know that much of what he's talking about is how the church began to think differently about the issues of Torah and grace.
All right, we want to finish up this teaching on law and grace. And I'm sorry if I'm going a bit quick. I actually packed in too much for the amount of time. I didn't estimate well. So I'll do my best to make sure that I don't just skip past something that I think needs further explanation. Remember that we had just, before we ate dinner, we were just talking about how this whole idea of replacement theology then contributes to this separation of Torah and grace, since Torah was very much connected with the Jewish community, and in fact the Torah would have defined the Jewish community, at least from their perspective. You could see why the emerging Christian church now that had gained an anti-Jewish perspective would likewise transfer that to an anti-Torah perspective. The two go hand in hand, all right? You could think of it this way, just a little. This may not be a good illustration, but say, for instance, and I hope nobody is thinking I'm saying this, so if you just woke up, please wake up. Or if you're listening to this tape in the future, or this recording in the future, I'm giving an illustration. What would happen if the Quran were a sacred book that we felt we needed to adhere to, but we couldn't put up with all of the things that was going on with Islam? And we divided away from Islam in our own group with our own emphasis, which was one of peace rather than war, and one of acceptance of others rather than annihilation of others, and so forth. But the Quran continued to be a sacred book. Would we have a tendency to distance ourselves from the Quran? Yes, of course we would. Why? Because the Quran is identified with them. And we don't want to be identified with them. So you could see the same thing going on as the emerging Christian church divided away from the Jewish community. The book that defined the Jewish community was the Torah. If it defines the Jewish community, we don't want it to define us. Why? Because we're not them, and they are not us. We now have begun to put up landmarks of other. We have defined who we are by defining who they are, and we're not them. So you can see how that, therefore, would have contributed to that. The law was viewed as something Jewish and not essential to Christian faith. That which condemns rather than brings life. Given by God as a punishment rather than a blessing. Used by Israel for self-righteousness. In other words, now that we're distancing ourselves from the Jews, we're also looking at everything we can that could possibly be negative at the Torah. And when we read Paul, does Paul give some negatives to the Torah? It's not the Torah's fault. But what does the Torah do to those who rebel against God? Condemns them. Right? So when Paul says the Torah condemns, then if you're already looking for something that's wrong with the Torah, you just say, look what the Torah does. It condemns. You could see how they would have therefore moved into a test, that the Torah was a test to see whether Israel would trust in God or trust in their own works, thus contrary to saving faith. In contrast, the gospel was viewed as far superior when compared to the law. The true rule of life for Christians was therefore not the Torah, but was the gospel.
I just want to affirm, and I'll go back just quickly here. This was, as I sat in church over the decades that I sat in church, what would have been almost 30 years, something like that. This is what he just explained is a good summary of what I learned over the course of that time. That the perspectives on the law and Torah, and the perspectives on the gospel and this time, this new covenant grace that we would be in. It's just a good summary of exactly what I experienced in the church and what I think is probably very germane. I'll just affirm that he is explaining what I would have seen in those days.
For Christians was therefore not the Torah, but was the gospel. Why? Does the gospel ever condemn? Well, not if you receive it. The gospel is a message of good news. The third thing that contributed a lot to the division of the grace from Torah was a Greek versus a Hebrew worldview. Now, these are all wrapped together, right? Remember that the teachers that were the primary teachers of the emerging Christian church were those that had been trained in a Hellenistic education. So they had a Greek worldview versus a Hebrew worldview. Since the emerging Christian church was led by teachers who were trained, it was only natural that they would interpret the Bible from a Greek perspective rather than from the Hebraic perspective of the Bible's human authors. And now I'm narrowing it down and becoming very, what shall I say? I'm giving you just a pinch of an outline here. There was much more that we could say. But Platonic philosophy, that is the philosophy of Plato, dominated the Greek worldview. If you don't believe that, just spend some time reading about the Greek literature, ancient Greek literature, and see how both Plato and Aristotle, who were on opposite sides of certain issues, but nonetheless Plato dominated Greek philosophy and worldview. At the core of Platonic philosophy is that what is real exists primarily in the idea rather than in physical substance. I don't know if this is still used, if people would even know what it means, but back when I was a young boy, people still understood the idea of a platonic relationship. So, if my dad saw me walking home with a girl from school, and he later on in the evening said, "Tim, who was that gal you were walking home with?" I said, "Don't worry, Dad. It's totally a platonic relationship." What does that mean? It means there's no physicality to it at all. We're not interested in each other physically. We're just exchanging ideas. Now, any dad that thinks a teenage son is on the right mark when he says we just have a platonic relationship needs to have some parenting skills. Okay, so it's from Plato that we get, it's the thought that counts, right? Can you see how Platonic philosophy came into early Christianity? By the way, did you know that Augustine, or Augustine, however you want to pronounce his name, St. Augustine, he was a student of Platonic philosophy before he came into belief in Jesus. And he was grateful for that because he said, in Platonic philosophy, there was a lot of the gospel contained even though he didn't realize it. Oh, really? Well, this is one of the ways that Platonic philosophy came into Christianity. What would some of the things be? We know that you're saved when you think the right things and speak what you're thinking. How do you get saved? You say yes to a list of beliefs, right? Here's a creed. I believe in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, Virgin Mary, and you come into the church and they say, "Are you saved?" You say, "Yes." You say, "Okay, when were you saved?" "Well, I accepted Jesus such and such a time." "Okay, we want to make sure you're saved. Please read this doctrinal statement. Do you agree with it?" "Yes." "Okay, you're right, you're saved. Sign here, you can become a member." That's so foreign to Jewish Hebrew thought. You agree with something in your mind and that saves you? Or, this is the one that always got me as we were talking more and more about things messianic. I keep the Sabbath in my heart. That's Platonic. That's Plato's philosophy, right? I'd love to be able to call up the utility company and say, "Just want to let you know, I paid my utility bill in my heart." I've been trying to diet in my heart for a long time, and it hasn't worked. As I eat that cheesecake out there, I say, I'm sure this won't be too many calories. I'm positive. So, within Plato's philosophy of the idea, your faith is what is inside of you. What you think is your faith. What you believe is what you think in your head. So faith is inside of you. Nobody can see your faith. That's why you can be a closet Christian. It's not good, but you can be one. Of course, that's not what James said. James said, if you have faith, I want to see it. And if I can't see it, your faith is dead. Right? What is one of the core ideas of Plato's philosophy? The one and the many. What does that mean? The one is that which gives meaning and reality to the many. The one is the idea that gives form to things. I know this is a little heavy, especially after dinner and late at night, but stick with me. The many are the physical objects in the world which have no meaning or reality apart from the one, the singular idea that groups things into a unified category. Let me see if I can illustrate it. There was an ad back in some years ago in the United States about ketchup. You got all kinds of ketchup. Okay? Got all kinds of brands, all kinds of bottles. They're all saying they're the best. So you're at the store and you're saying, which one should I buy? What is the real ketchup in all of this? I want to know the real ketchup. Okay? So they came out with an ad for Heinz tomato ketchup that said, Heinz is the ketchup lover's ketchup. It means if you want to test whether ketchup is good or bad or indifferent, you have to put it up against Heinz. Heinz is the one that gives meaning to all the rest. Since in Plato's philosophy the one is the thought or idea which gives meaning and reality to the physical things, the non-physical is valued above the physical. In fact, only when one escapes the connection to the physical can the true idea or concept be realized. This is why amongst some of the emerging Christian church and amongst some of the Christian church today, rich people are thought to be less spiritual than poor people. Why do you think that in the monastic movement of the Middle Ages, those who were thought to be most spiritual, what did they do? They separated themselves from all pleasures of life. Right? Marriage, comfort, home. They went off in the desert, lived in a cave, ate as little as they could, didn't talk to people. Why? Because the more you move away from the physical, the more spiritual you are. Now, don't think we're all exempt from that. You know, when the rabbi shows up in a new Jaguar, you're going to say to yourself, wait a minute, what's this guy doing with his money? You know, how can he have some new car? If he were spiritual, he would have given that to the missionaries. There's something deep down inside of us that says, poor is more spiritual and rich is less spiritual. Why? Physical things are bad. That's not what God said. He created the world, and he looked at what he created, and he said, that is good. If the physical were bad, why is he going to resurrect our bodies? We could finally be rid of all of this nonsense and just be floating spirits. Wouldn't that be wonderful? No, it wouldn't be wonderful. Why? Because somehow God in his greatness says that he created things for our enjoyment. You shouldn't feel guilty when you're happy. Right? That's one of the great things about coming into a Hebraic way of worship. Why do you suppose God has favored so many, down through the generations, so many families, generations of Israelis and Jewish families with the ability to make some money? Now, don't get this myth that all the Jews are rich, because I'm living proof that that's not the case. Rich in many ways, though, but not just in money. Okay? But why is that? Because deep-seated in the Hebrew Jewish perspective is that it's okay to be blessed. Okay, he said he's going to bless us. And the blessing isn't just in non-physical things. Now, we can be blessed by giving physical things away. Tremendously blessed. Escaping the physical world in order to enter the realm of the ethereal, the world of ideas, should be the ultimate goal of all thinking people, according to Plato. This worldview exerted a strong influence upon the teaching in the early emerging Christian church. It opened the door to Gnosticism, which held that all physical things contained an inherent evil, and it redefined the concept of spiritual as that which is non-physical. Did you see where I made that link now? If Plato says the non-physical is best, now when you start reading the Bible, the stuff that relates to the physical is secondary, and the stuff that relates to the non-physical is primary. It's not difficult to see how this Greek worldview encouraged a law versus grace theology. The Torah is very much concerned about life in this world, in the physicality of our world, right? The physical tabernacle, the temple, the physical sacrifices. It talks about property, ownership, clothing, crops, flocks, first fruits, calendars, festivals, physical work and physical rest, food, circumcision. Can you imagine circumcision? The ritual purity of the physical body. It says everything is physical in the Torah. Well, it's not really, right? It says circumcise your heart. It says circumcise your ears. In fact, one of the things that was amazing to me when the first time that we started really studying through the Torah was how much it related to one's heart, how much it related to one's thoughts. But you see, God ties together the physical world with the non-physical world. You and I all know that even when we are really intent upon studying the Word of God, if we have a splitting headache, it's difficult. Right? No matter how much we want, when we're sick, we say, oh, I just can't do this. We can pray, we can moan, we can call out to God, but there's all kinds of things that we just don't have the spiritual energy to do. Our physical life and our non-physical inward being are linked together. Taking the view that the physical was inherently evil, it was an easy step to consider Torah as dealing with that realm of life which the true Christian had rejected. I don't need anybody to tell me about property and ownership and clothing and crops. Why? This world is not my home. I'm just passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. Right? What's my goal? To get out of this place. What is the biblical goal for the people of God? To create a place where God will dwell with us here. To make your table a place where the dwelling of God is evident. Right? The later rabbi said, where two or three gather and eat together and speak about the things of Torah, the Shekinah, the very visible glory of God, is there on your table. And God said to the people of Israel, make a tabernacle. Make a mishkan. What is mishkan? It's a place to dwell. Shekan means to dwell. The mishkan is the word for tabernacle. Make a place for me to dwell in your midst. Our purpose for being here on this earth is to glorify and sanctify God's name on this earth. How do you do that? You follow Torah by the power of the Spirit. When you follow Torah, it's going to make a difference in your marriage. It better make a difference in your marriage, or you better go back and study Torah. It's going to make a difference in the way that you look at your kids. It's going to make a difference in the way that you handle your business. It's going to make a difference in the way you talk to your neighbors. It's going to make a difference in the way you sanctify God's name upon this earth. So, the Christians had a tendency to value the non-physical above the physical, the spiritual above the physical. And by the way, spiritual doesn't always mean non-physical. Don't you love that in Galatians when he says, you who are spiritual, restore the one who has fallen? What does that mean? All of you that float around as spirits? No, you that are spiritual, meaning you that have the mind of the Spirit. You that are led by the Spirit of God. You that have shown yourself to be mature in the things of righteousness. You are the ones who should go and restore the one who has fallen. Therefore, according to the emerging Christian church, the new gospel is for the Christian, not the old law. But let's reread the Bible to discover what it really says. God never intended to have two peoples with two distinct callings and two distinct missions, that is, Israel and the church. I'm always nervous when my Messianic brothers and sisters talk about the unique calling of Israel. Well, I'm not sure what they mean by that, but if they mean that the physical descendants of Jacob have a unique calling from everybody else, I don't agree with that. I think Israel has a unique calling, but I think everybody that's grafted into Israel falls into that unique calling. It has nothing to do with ethnicity. It has to do with God's choice. And if he chose you to be in Israel, to be part of Israel, then he chose you to fulfill the calling that Israel has, which is what? To be a light to the nations. We read in John 10, I have other sheep which are not of this fold. He's talking to the Jewish people. I have other sheep which are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. One flock with one shepherd.
Oh, he may cover it in the rest of this video, but this seems worth, he's speaking about things to which I give a hearty amen to. And that there's not supposed to be two separate chosen people. There's one chosen people. And I agree with him. Now, it's hard because we know that there's a natural Israel, those who are the blood descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are also identified. But it becomes pretty clear when you're reading the old writings that there is a remnant of Israel, meaning that as many of the natural Israelites turned away, they basically, as they turned away, as we said in the previous video, maybe as a natural Israelite, you start out as the elect and chosen of Israel just by virtue of being natural Israel. But to stay in Israel, the chosen elect, you must be obedient. You must follow Yahweh. Otherwise, you will find yourself on the outside, which that messaging starts in the old writings, but it continues right on through all the new writings. It goes right on through the Gospels and the accounts of Yahushua and the teachings of the apostles. So I'm just agreeing that, one people, one chosen people, that starts with natural Israel, those descendants. But to that, as he mentioned, the outsiders were always welcome to come and join. You want to become part of the hope and part of the Israel and receive the benefits of being Israel. Come on, join us. But they were always called in the old writings to take their ways and begin to conform them to the ways of Israel and the ways of Yahweh, because what Yahweh was trying to do is get Israel to live according to his ways, which they failed to do as a large natural body. It's the remnant of Israel, the smaller group within Israel, that stayed true to him to the best of their ability and will ultimately receive the promises. So just agreeing with all of that, but I also want to just make note in this because of the time I have spent in Ezekiel and some of the other writings. It's so clear that, when he's speaking to the Yehudim, those of the southern kingdom that are living in the land and speaking to them as lost sheep, he's saying, I also have other sheep which are not of this fold, and I've got to bring them in also, and they will hear my voice. When the Father calls them, they will respond to me, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. So when we get into the writings of Ezekiel, we know that when the house of David is rebuilt, when the teacher of righteousness comes, when all of the references to the Messiah, him coming back and leading Israel, when those references are made, one of the ways that the Messiah is referred to, and one of the references to him, is that he will be the shepherd of Israel. Where all the other shepherds have failed, he will be the true shepherd. And so we see him referencing himself as throughout the Gospels, lots of accounts and lots of references to sheep and shepherds, because that is, that was just part of the old writings and part of the illustration that they're providing. But the point is, in the concept of, do we have Israel of a one-day people that have come and gone, as we just read a little bit ago, who may or may not have a future, but we don't really know. But when Yahushua came his first time, he established a second and distinct body of believers, primarily constituted of Gentile believers, subject to a new covenant that he instituted when he came here, that is spiritual in nature, as he's talking about, all the concepts that if you keep all the commands of the new writings, you will be doing everything of the old writings and then some, but which is not true. If you really study that out, it won't be true. But I'm just affirming all of this and wanting to point out that when we say one flock with one shepherd, you can get back into Ezekiel and show this, that when we are talking about, if we are indeed talking about one flock with one shepherd, and if the Gentiles are joining this flock rather than having their own separate covenant and rules and rewards associated with it, if they actually are just, end up becoming part of one flock, then the flock that they're becoming part of is Israel. I'm just saying that I'm just agreeing with this, and the concept that he has said elsewhere, that as the church, we are not a separate and distinct body. We have joined Israel, and Israel has one shepherd. They are one flock, and we have just joined that remnant of Israel who will follow and hear the voice of their shepherd.
Many nations will join themselves to the Lord in that day. This is Zechariah 2:11, all right? Many nations will join themselves to the Lord in that day. I want to stop and just make a point there, because it doesn't say many nations will join themselves to Israel. It says many nations will join themselves to the Lord in that day and will become my people. What? Yes, if you have been grafted in to that tree which has the roots in its covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you are part of God's people. And then it says, then I will dwell in your midst. He's talking to Israel in Zechariah. And you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent... What? Wait a minute, who is talking here? Let's read it again. Who's talking? Many nations will join themselves to the Lord in that day and will become my people. My people. That's who's talking. My. Then I will dwell in your midst, he's talking to Israel, and you will know that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh of hosts has sent me to you. Now some would say all of a sudden it changes and that's Zechariah talking, but I think the text is right that capitalizes the word me. I think Yeshua is the spirit of prophecy here, as he indicated, as Peter indicates in his first chapter. So, there is one body and one spirit, just as you also were called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one mikvah, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all.
It occurs to me, as one of the things that is difficult in Scripture is knowing what belongs in the Messianic age, or even previous. What age does everything belong to? The pre-Messianic age, the times prior to Messiah coming the first time, or the Messianic age, which is his having come and established himself as Messiah from the date of his birth forward, or are we talking about what will take place when he comes back the second time? Because right now we know that our Messiah is up in the Shemayim, up in the heavenlies, with his Father. But there's a day when that abode changes. He comes from up. In fact, he moves his home from up there down to here. He moves the whole thing. So he will come and establish things here. So when we're talking about the many nations will join themselves to the Lord in that day, we always have to, I always wonder about what that day is. So what day are you talking about? Because we have references to a day being 1,000 years as a day. We have references to that day being a season of time, which is that time period where like the day of Yahweh will be a time period where he's meting out his retribution upon the earth. So in that day can be a period of time like 1,000 years. And so I have oftentimes thought, if you think about 1,000 years being a day and a day is 1,000 years, then you can divide the time frame of earth into 7 days. And Yahushua would have been born right at the end of the 4th day, at the beginning of the 5th day then. And so now we're living in the 5th and the 6th days. That's the 2,000 years prior to the 7th day that we've been living in. So when we say last days, is it the last 2 days? Is it the 5th and 6th day of these last 2 days? Maybe the 5th, 6th, and 7th day of those last days. Sometimes when I'm reading the scriptures and we talk about in the last days, in the last two days, last 2,000 years, people will be doing certain types of things, maybe. And but also, in the last days, we sometimes would think of that as the last days, that last couple years, that season of time, that is the day of York. So when we go to Zechariah 2:11 and we see that many nations will join themselves to Yahweh in that day and will become my people. Well, I know that from reading the old writings, that if that day is when he comes back the second time and we're all resurrected, there are so many references to this taking place in that day that we will be resurrected and we will be literally joined to, physically joined to Israel, because we'll be living amongst his people. And the references throughout the old writings where he says, in that day they will become my people and I will become their Elohim. Over and over again. It's such a recurrent theme. And the reason that I'm thinking maybe this would be an end time reference to that day, to that day, is because he will be dwelling in our midst. And you will know that Yahweh of hosts has sent me to you. And who is me? He's saying it's Yahushua, and I don't argue with that. I think that is Yahushua as well. But I know that in some of the church teachings, they'll be talking about, he resides in the temple of your heart. So he has his Mishkan here, his abode is here, his temple is here, because he resides in your heart as a believer. I know that is a teaching of the church, and I'm not even really arguing with it, because I think there are references to the idea that his spirit does dwell within us, that his spirit, as we are a believer, has joined himself to us literally. There's some sort of inner thing that takes place that I don't fully understand. I don't know that anybody fully understands it, or how could you? All we can do is ever speculate on it. But I think that's going on now. But there is a literal dwelling in our midst that is a constant theme of the old writings, becomes a constant theme of the new writings, and it has a literal fulfillment, not in just the spirit will come and abide. No, literally, in his physical, natural, resurrected state, Yahushua, and he's bringing his Father, they're going to come and dwell in our midst, literally. So it is possible that when Zechariah is referencing that many nations will join themselves to the Lord in that day, maybe we're talking about the period of the Messianic age, because we're seeing people, Gentiles of other nations, joining and becoming the remnant of Israel. In fact, it seems very likely that the majority of the remnant now would be people outside of Israel, just by virtue of the law of numbers. I'm speculating there, but I suppose. So maybe this many nations will join themselves to Yahweh in that day and will become my people. Maybe that's referencing what has taken place in the last couple thousand years. I think the church would say that that's what's taking place. I think the church would say that this dwelling in the midst is the time when, you've got the spirit of Yahweh dwelling in your heart. But the references to this dwelling in our midst and this reference to that day, I think this is an end time reference. And that many nations, literal nations, not just Gentiles of the nations, but the nations themselves will also identify with and turn to Yahweh in those days. Lots of descriptions of the day, the millennial age that we would get into. But then just to finish up here, there is one body, one spirit, just as you were called in one hope of your calling. What is the hope of your calling? Well, if you go back into the old writings, you learn that it is all of these promises of that second coming and him coming down to dwell in our midst and us being resurrected and receiving the bodies that we're meant to have, that will be able to keep Torah and do all of these things. These are the hope of our calling, where we will have one master, one Adon, one faith, one baptism, one Elohim, and one Father of all, which is, when we get into that millennial period and going forward, it will all be reunited. Right now, they're up there. Whatever they're doing down here is done spiritually within us. But literally, the day is coming when it's all coming down here, and all of earth and all of heaven will be one. And so I think this is what Paul's referencing here.
One God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. Is there any way that Paul could have been clearer than that? I don't think he could. I don't think there's any way that he could have been clearer than that. God never intended that his Torah should be something contrary to his grace or opposed to the good news. You can't have one people and have two messages given to them that are contrary. Look at Psalm 19. The Torah of the Lord is perfect. What does that mean? It means without anything missing, restoring the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure. What does that mean? Unchanging. It never changes. And by the way, every one of these words, Torah and testimony and so forth, are all synonyms for the teaching of God, the Torah. The precepts of the Lord are right, never wrong. You can always trust them. Rejoicing in the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, meaning what? It has no admixture of anything that's going to hurt you, take you away in a wrong way, or in any way bring you into disrepute or failure. Pure. It's like, when you're out hiking and you're thirsty and you didn't bring enough water with you, and you're looking at the water and you're saying, should I drink this or not? How fast is it running? Where did it come from? How many beavers are upstream? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have to worry about it with regard to the Torah. The Torah has that mark on the bottle that says 100% pure. The fear of the Lord is clean. Meaning what? It's not going to take you away from God. It's going to bring you close to God. Remember, clean and unclean relates to relationship and admission into God's presence, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true. They are righteous altogether. Now, I love it when it says altogether. They are righteous in a unit that you can't take apart. This is David saying this. Is this the inspired word of God? You can't say, this one is ceremonial, we don't need it. This one is civil, we don't need it. This one is moral, okay, let's take that one. You can't do that. According to David, they all are woven together. They are more desirable than gold. Really? Yes, than much fine gold. They are sweeter also than honey, and the drippings of the honeycomb. Moreover, by them your servant is warned, and keeping them there is great reward. What happened to Psalm 19 when the church was trying to decide whether to keep the Torah or not? I don't know. God never intended that his Torah should be something contrary to his grace or opposed to the good news. Romans 7:12, Paul says, so then the Torah is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. And in a verse just below that, he says in verse 14, for we know that the Torah is spiritual. What does that mean? Let's just stop and talk about that for a minute. What does it mean that Torah is spiritual? Moving? Of God? Okay? I think it means this. You don't get it if you don't have the Spirit. You don't understand it if you don't have the Spirit. Now, you may have a lot of knowledge about what it means, but you haven't got a clue on how it is to be applied. And this is why Paul can later say in his epistle that even though they had a zeal for God, they tried to make their own righteousness. The Torah isn't bad. It's just you don't understand it unless you read it with the eyes of the Spirit. Paul says in chapter 3 of Romans, so then, do we nullify the Torah through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the Torah. Could that be any clearer? Or what about Acts 24:14? But this I admit to you, Paul says, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the Lord, the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the Torah and is written in the prophets. The question that now confronts us is this. If the law or Torah is not contrary to God's grace, how should we understand those passages in the Bible that seem to teach otherwise? Now, I was planning to break here, okay? So that's why I say stay tuned for part 2. Now we're supposed to go eat dinner. All right, so let's go right on to part 2. I want to study something that's still pre-Paul. You say, where are we going to get to Paul? Yeah, maybe. I want to study Matthew 5:17 through 20. If you want to open up your Bibles, you can. You can look up at the screen. But I'm just going to point out a few things that you may already know these things, but I want to point them out nonetheless. This is a critical passage for us. There are some people who say, well, Matthew was written to the Jews, wasn't written to us. There's all kinds of ways of getting around this. Do you know that there's only one time where the word church is used in the Gospels? The word ecclesia is used in the Gospels. It's in the book of Matthew. I will build my ecclesia, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. All right. You'll notice how that I've outlined this on the screen there with some indents. I'm trying to show you some parallels in the way that the text lays out. The first lines are, I think, the primary message, and that's why I put them in bold. Do not think that I came to abolish the Torah, Yeshua is speaking, obviously, or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Now let's think a little further on this. What does the word abolish mean? He used it twice. Abolish is the Greek word kataluo, which means to render something ineffective. It can mean to break it down, to smash it, but in terms of laws, and it's used in other, not in biblical literature, it's used this way, but also in non-biblical literature, it means to take something that is a law or an edict and render it ineffective. He said, I didn't come to do that. Now let's ask this question. Why would anyone have thought? Why did he even have to say this? Who was thinking that he came to abolish the Torah or the prophets? Who would have thought that? Any ideas? In fact, that question is so burning that there are some liberal scholars who say this must have been added later. The problem with that is if it was added later, he would have said, I did come to abolish the Torah, because if it was added later by the Christian church, that's what they wanted him to say. Why would anyone have thought that he might be there to tear down, to make ineffective the Torah or the prophets? Yes? I think so. This lady has, I think, hit the nail right on the head. It's that the leaders, the Jewish leaders, were putting their own laws as equal with the Torah of Moses. And when Yeshua was not willing to agree that their laws had equal value, they were saying, look, he's wiping out what we're doing. He's abolishing the Torah. But why does he say, and prophets? We'll talk about that in a minute. What about this word fulfill? It's the word plerao, the normal word to fill, but in many cases it means to bring to a designed end or goal. You know, when you have a cup, a glass, and you begin to fill it up with water, you're filling it up. When it gets to its, so it can't take any more, it's fulfilled. It's full filled. It's filled full. That's what the word means. Okay? So you always have a goal when you're filling up a glass to fill it up, right? If that's your goal, when you fill it up, you've reached your goal. So he said, I didn't come to make the Torah or the prophets ineffective. I came to fill them up to their completion, to bring them to their ultimate goal. Then notice the next phrase starts with for, which means it's linking. Now, I've heard a lot of my Christian brothers and sisters quote this verse. I do not think I came to abolish the Torah of the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. They say, there, you have it. He fulfilled it. What they mean by fulfill is, he did it, so I don't have to. Right? He did it all, so I don't have to worry about it. But they don't read the rest of the passage. The next verse starts with the word for, which links it to what he's just said. Now here's what I mean, he's saying. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass away from the Torah until all is accomplished. Now the question I have is, do you see how he is linking thoughts together? Abolish, in the first verse, is reiterated with a different term, pass away or pass from. So what he means is a stroke or a letter, something being taken away that is no longer effective in the Torah. You don't have to erase something out of the Torah to make it ineffective. You can just say it no longer applies. What's the difference? Everybody says, well, we would never strike any words out of the Bible. But what's the difference if you don't strike the word out of the Bible, but you tell everybody it doesn't matter? It's the same thing. Now here's the question. In the first verse, he says, Torah or the prophets. He says, do not think I came to abolish the Torah or the prophets. But now he says, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass away from the Torah. Why doesn't he say the Torah and the prophets? I think because he wants us to know that he's speaking about the Torah that is written, not the Torah that is oral. Because there's no oral prophets. When he says the Torah or the prophets, he's getting everyone thinking on the same page. That page is a written page. So he's talking about the Torah of Moses. That is the first part, which is followed by the written prophets, the written Torah, the written prophets. What does the word accomplished mean? It's actually the word to become. It's the word we get Genesis from, genao. And it means to come into being or to attain its full purpose. So you can see then that accomplish answers to fulfill. Right? I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. That is, to bring it to its proper goal. And what does accomplish means? Not the smallest letter from the Torah is going to pass away until all is accomplished, until it has its full effects that God intends. The next verse has the word then in it, in my translation. That's actually similar to the word for, and it links it again, this verse with the previous verse. They're all linked together. You can't tear them apart. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom. when I read this years and years ago as I was studying in seminary, I thought to myself, how could I have read that verse and never understood it, because it's so plain? And I look back in my young years as I taught Bible studies and so forth, and what did I do? I taught the same thing that I was taught. As a believer in Jesus, I was taught that the Torah didn't matter. The law didn't matter anymore. I didn't have to do those things. I never had a twinge of conscience growing up as a young boy when I didn't keep the Sabbath, because I was told I didn't have to do that. I wasn't supposed to do that. And now I was ready and preparing to teach others, and I was thinking, what? Whoever annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom. I don't want to be called least in the kingdom. How many people today are teaching others that the Torah has been done away with and are teaching others not to do it? But I want you to note one thing. That this word annul can mean not only to loose, but to destroy, to render useless. It literally means to loose. Remember in Matthew when Yeshua said to Peter, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom. Well, whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. Okay, we can talk more about that. But to loose and to bind means to make something incumbent on somebody or to not incumbent upon others. I would be extremely careful before I ever taught somebody there's a commandment of God in the Bible, but you don't have to do it. I would be very, very nervous about such things. So you can see once again, looks like my colors are a little dark, sorry about that abolish, pass from, and annul all have the same idea. Whoever then annuls is the same way as a stroke or letter passing away or is abolishing something in the Torah. You can see that line of thought? Okay? Now the next verse starts with another connective word. But whoever keeps and teaches. So keeps is opposite of annul. Right? You see the parallelism? Are you with me? Stick with me. I know this is a little difficult. Okay? Whoever then annuls will be, and teaches others will be least. Whoever keeps and teaches. Can you see how keeps is the opposite of annul? He shall be called great in the kingdom. But guess what? In my translation, the word keeps is actually in the Greek the word do. To perform, to do. So we should translate it, but whoever keeps, or whoever does and teaches them. Whoever does the commandments and teaches them. You know why it's important to do the commandments before you teach them? Because don't follow a teacher who tells you to do something but doesn't do it himself. That's exactly what Yeshua said in Matthew 23, right? We were talking about that earlier. They sit in the seat of Moses, therefore what they tell you do, but don't do what they do. Teachers should model the truth before they teach it. You can see how keeps or does is parallel with accomplished, is therefore parallel with fulfilled. All right. Then, last verse. For, and again we have that connective word, for I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. I was talking to the lady here about that. Go ahead. So you're saying that those who have a lesser, you're asking is, those who have a lesser righteousness will still be in the world to come, but they will be exceeded by some whose righteousness surpasses them, right? Like there's two levels? Okay, so it depends whether you get front row seats or not. Okay. Well, let's see what it says. Surpass means to abound, to be in abundance over. Okay? And we can see, for instance, that surpass then parallels keeps, is parallel with accomplished, and is parallel with fulfilled. All of those words are carrying the same kind of idea. I didn't come to abolish, but to fulfill. I came that the Torah should accomplish its goals. Whoever does them and whose righteousness surpasses. So those are all kind of linked together. Now to the question, how does one's righteousness surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees? He admits that there is a certain righteousness with the scribes and the Pharisees, doesn't he? But what kind of righteousness is that? It's righteousness as viewed and understood within the context of this world. Would you say somebody is righteous when they return something that you lost on the ground? You know, if you left your camera somewhere where you're on vacation and someone finds it and finds out it's yours and returns it to you, wouldn't you say that they're righteous in that act? Does that mean that they have a place in the world to come? Not necessarily. So, were the scribes and the Pharisees viewed in their activities as righteous, at least those that could be seen? Yes. In fact, very righteous. They were careful about everything to an nth degree. So they're used as a level of saying you must be intent upon this. It's not something that you can just say, well, it'll just happen. No, in the same way that the scribes and the Pharisees were concerned about living according to a certain rule, you too must be concerned to live the way God intends. So how could your righteousness surpass theirs? It has to do with motive. All right? What did we say earlier that Paul said in Romans 7:14? We know that the Torah is spiritual. Why do you keep the Torah? Why did the scribes and Pharisees keep the Torah? Well, Yeshua gives us at least an insight in Matthew 23 as to why the motive for some of them. To be seen of men. To be seen of men. They wanted their tefillin to be large. They wanted their tzitzit to be long. They wanted to have the special places of seats because they wanted people to know, I'm righteous. What should be the motive for us as we keep Torah? Pardon me? Yes. Love. Love for God and love for our neighbor. In fact, Yeshua said, oftentimes, you should do the mitzvot in secret so nobody sees you. If it's when you give charity, when you give tzedakah, don't let your right hand know what your left hand's doing. I've always been amazed at sometimes the praise services that I've been in at times in different places. Where someone says, I just thank the Lord that He's been so gracious to me that I've been able to give thousands of dollars to this charity. That's not a praise to God. That's a pat on your own back. You see, the motive makes all the difference. And as I was talking in the break, even the rabbi said that your motive makes a difference, right? If you go down to the mikveh, according to Rambam, if you go down to the mikveh with the idea of just taking a bath, the mikveh doesn't do anything for you in making you ceremonially clean. You have to go with the motive, with the idea of saying, I'm going down here to obey a commandment. This is why the rabbis made a blessing for every commandment. Every time you fulfill a commandment, if you want to, there's a blessing.
Mikvah is baptism, in case you were wondering.
Right? And that's why it always says, who sanctified us with His commandments. Why do you bless God? Because when you bless God for the commandment, you're saying, I'm doing it for you. Now, you can say it and not mean it. We do that a lot, right? We can pray prayers and not mean it. But the issue is your heart. Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So the answer to the question is no. Unless your heart is right, unless your motive is right, you won't even enter the kingdom of heaven. No one can come to the Father, Yeshua said, but through me. Okay, can I comment on the word, which one? Unless... Oh, well, yeah, so this goes to the lady's question here, right? I think least in the kingdom means least in the kingdom right now. I'm not sure it's talking about the kingdom of heaven, that is the kingdom in the world to come. In other words, do you want to be great in God's kingdom? Is God's kingdom now? We say yes, no. Yes, but there's more to come. Okay. Do you want to be seen? Do you want God to count you as great in the kingdom now, or least? When we stand before Him, He's going to say, "Well done, good and faithful servant," or is He going to say, "Why didn't you do what I asked you to do?" I think
Well, he may address this again, but I would part with him on that, because I do not know this, but I do not get the impression that when the second coming occurs, when we are resurrected and we go into our abodes, that those abodes are any more cookie cutter and equal than it is in our world today. Everybody will receive the rewards for the things they have done on this earth at that time. And so if you're teaching people, if you're not keeping Torah, which are, I'm going to say, not just the law of Moses, but if you're not keeping all the commands of Yahweh, wherever you see a command, if you're not, as he's mentioning, and I agree with, from the heart, trying to keep all of the instructions of Yahweh, if that's not your goal, well, you're going to be counted least in the kingdom of God. Those are the reign of the Elohim, the reign of Elohim, or the reign of the Shemaim. Those who are trying to keep His instructions and His ways and do what they're supposed to do from the heart will be considered great in the kingdom. Well, in the kingdom, I suppose, as he's talking now, I do know the kingdom exists right now, because we have a king. There's a king, and he's got a kingdom, and the king right now resides up in the heavenlies, and we are part of that kingdom. But the kingdom that we are part of we're not necessarily embracing it and operating in it up in the heavenlies, and never will. We'll go to Sheol first, but when it comes down here, and it becomes part of this, the kingdom comes down here, well, it's going to be on the earth in a very tangible sense, and not just in this intangible sense that we're experiencing it now. So he's referencing this idea that the kingdom does exist here, and he knows that there's that tension of, what is the kingdom? But there's the literal kingdom coming to earth. And at that point in time, no, it's going to be physical and it's going to be tangible. And I don't think that when we go to reside there, that we're all going to be rewarded equally, that we're all going to be receiving the same kind of housing, the same kind of position, the same kind of things that would represent rewards. So he's saying that this passage has to do with how we're least or greatest in the kingdom on the earth now. Well, I think that is true, but I would not want to lose sight that it has eternal consequences. In my opinion, it has eternal consequence, not just temporal consequence, which I don't know that that's what he's trying to say, but that's what I received from him here.
Well done, good and faithful servant? Or is he going to say, why didn't you do what I asked you to do? I think the last verse tells us that what we do gives evidence of what's in our heart. Now, immediately I know what the next question is. What about all of our good brothers and sisters in the Lord, some of our own family and so forth, who are genuinely wonderful people, who genuinely love the Lord? What about them? I don't know the answers to that, but this text isn't trying to give us a what if. This text in Yeshua is trying to move us forward to say, I want to be great in the kingdom. Therefore, why wouldn't we be? Why wouldn't we want to be great in God's kingdom, right? I kind of collate this to 1 Corinthians 3, where Paul says that even though if you build with wood, hay, and stubble, it'll be burned up, but you'll still be saved. Yes, sir.
The Russian translation said this is the smallest one.
The smallest one, okay. That's a possible translation. It does mean a small one, or least, but it can mean least in terms of, what would be the smallest one mean? Be receiving less praise?
Yeah.
Okay. Apparently, when we stand before the Almighty, before Yeshua, He's going to He's going to wipe away tears. What are the tears for? How many tears do you want to shed there? How much do we really want to hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant"? If you want to hear, "Well done, and good and faithful servant," then I can tell you from this text for sure, if I even can't explain all of the other things, do the Torah and teach others to do it, and do it with the right motive, to love God, to show Him that you love Him and you love your neighbor. Do it in the power of the Spirit, and do it for His eyes and nobody else's. What have we learned? Yeshua came so that His people would live righteously. Don't let anybody think I came to abolish the Torah. I didn't come to abolish the Torah, but to make its purpose come about. What does the Torah purpose? What is God's purpose for the Torah? That it should be a pattern of life, teaching us how to walk in His ways. His death and resurrection releases His people from the bondage of sin and death. The indwelling Ruach empowers His people to live holy lives. Even the smallest part of the Torah, second thing we learn, will not be abolished as long as heaven and earth remain. So don't tell me that this part counts and that part doesn't. Anybody that wants to put them all into ceremonial, civil, moral, that's nonsense. Excuse me for being blunt. I shouldn't say it that way. That just doesn't work. Tell me, is the Sabbath ceremonial, civil, or moral? Well, it certainly is ceremonial, right? Because there's things we do and don't do regarding whether it's Sabbath or not Sabbath. Is it civil? Yeah, it is, because at least within the confines of when we are living in the land, and when the priesthood and so forth is available, if you desecrate the Sabbath, what's the result? You die. Execution, that's civil. How about moral? What word is used when you break the Sabbath? It says to profane the Sabbath. That's a moral term. I don't see how you can take the commandments and divide them up. It's an impossibility. Yeshua has determined that the Torah should bring about the goal for which it was given. That is, that it would be the pattern for righteous living for all who are His people. So do you want Yeshua to consider you great in His kingdom? Then do the Torah and teach others to do it. But if Yeshua did not abolish the Torah, did Paul? Sometimes I think that my Christian brothers and sisters, back when everybody was wearing the bracelets, I told them you should have WWPD. What would Paul do? Because you admit that Yeshua lived by the Torah. Not what would Yeshua do, what would Paul do, or even better, what would the church fathers do, because that's really where you are putting your emphasis. Paul was an apostle of Yeshua the Messiah. Tell me, what is an apostle? The word means to send, right? One who is sent with authority to deliver his master's message. If Yeshua clearly taught that he did not come to abolish the Torah, but rather to establish it in the lives of his people, then Paul could not truthfully claim to be the apostle of Yeshua and at the same time knowingly change the message. It's just that simple. If you agree with me that Yeshua did not abolish the Torah or come to abolish the Torah, then you simply cannot tell me Paul taught that he did. Because if you tell me that, I have to say Paul is a false apostle.
I'll just take a quick moment to comment here that this is one of the things that I came to the realization of, and that is that we know that Torah was the way of the community. Torah was the established, well, he called it identity, and it's true. Torah, as in somebody who's following their Adon, their Elohim, and doing the instructions of their Elohim, Elohim, which include then the law of Moses. Well, we know that's what Yahushua was born into, and that he kept the Torah. He had to, in order to fulfill it or do any of the things. But where would you see a clear transition away from Torah to eliminating Torah? Where do you see a clear transition? You would have to find in the Gospels, not in church doctrine, because the church doctrines will offer you evidences of the transition having taken place. But I find nowhere in any of the Gospels a transition from Torah to not Torah. And if that's true, his statement is so true. How can Paul be an apostle, eyewitness, and conveyor of the messaging of Yahushua if he's changing the messaging of Yahushua? He can't. But even so, I don't believe Paul ever did. I think that's church teaching that has him doing that. I think because Paul is dealing with Gentiles, some of what he says becomes difficult and controversial when you introduce other ideas of what he might have meant, and you begin teaching that and developing those ideas. Then you can take what Paul says and twist it, as Peter says in his second epistle in the Gospels. Twist it and come up with something else that does not represent what was taught in Scriptures. But I will say that nowhere in any writing of Paul, any writing of any epistle, let alone Paul's epistle, do we see a transition from Torah into non-Torah. All we see and all the church has built its doctrines from are references to the idea. Once you accept that the Torah must have been done away with, and then you begin to interpret what you're seeing Paul write based upon that presumption, then you can make what Paul's saying fit your narrative. But if you stay with the idea that Paul understood Torah did not go away, Torah was for him and his people, and Torah is for the new believer too, but there's a process that a Gentile who was not born into a Torah situation was rather born into an idolatrous nation, and in where he's at and where he's going, they're drinking blood, they're eating sacrificed animals, they are engaging in temple prostitution and other forms of whoring and sexual abhorrence to Yahweh, and then they are worshiping their idols. And so they're doing really horrific things against Yahweh, and that has to be stopped. But then they also need to be trained up now that we need to stop the idolatrous practices, stop them cold, the horrific idolatrous practices. Now that we've stopped them cold, here's how we begin to build you up and turn you into a Talmidim or a disciple, somebody who is now learning the ways of Israel, as Israel, which are really the ways of Yahweh that Israel was supposed to demonstrate. Didn't do a very good job at it, but basically that's Paul's role through the Torah and prophets and writings, begin teaching the Gentiles how to walk in the ways prescribed that Yahweh would want them to, now that they have joined his chosen people.
Do you understand my logic? I've often thought to myself, what would happen if I had come, brought my Bible, and in the middle of one of our sessions said, oh, okay, hold on a sec, everybody open up your Bible to the book of Ephesians. All right? Now take all the pages of Ephesians and rip them out of your Bible. Okay? Those, I'm telling you, are no longer authoritative. You can throw those away. Those don't matter anymore. What would you rightly do if I had been somebody who did that? You should have had a couple of guys come up here and pick me up and throw me out the door. Do you really think that Paul could have gone into the synagogues of the first century and say, I just want you to know that the Torah has been abolished? I mean, who could have thought such a thing? Or even if he had come into one of the synagogues and said, I want you to know the Sabbath is no more. They would have kicked him out on his ear as a heretic. How could he have, before the judge, the Roman judge, say, I have done nothing against the people of Israel or the Torah of Moses, and not been an out-and-out liar if he had told them to abolish the Sabbath? I just don't understand how people can continue to read the Bible and think that there is some consistency, that Yeshua and his apostles taught us that the Torah has been abolished. When you read the Bible, it simply cannot be read that way. So if Paul had done that, it would have made him an unfaithful and untruthful messenger.
Well, obviously it can be read that way, because once you have accepted the church teachings and the doctrines as your starting point and your perspective from which you're viewing what Paul is saying, oh, then you can read it, because you can turn it. You can make some of what Paul says fit that, a lot of what Paul says fit that narrative. But I understand what Tim says, and I think we all do. What he means by that is when you really start applying critical thought to it, when you really start reasoning it through, what the church has taught us begins to not make sense. The idea that the Torah was abolished in the days of Paul or any day, it becomes unrealistic. It's just not tenable when you are actually coming to terms with what the Hebraic roots of the first time Messiah came here, and what community he came to, and how they were living, and how it moved out from there amongst the Gentiles. Once you begin understanding and applying the idea that Torah was always and stayed in the messaging of Paul, even to the Gentiles, then as you read and you begin to read his letters, you begin to understand what he might be saying from a different perspective, which is almost certainly a more correct perspective, because you're starting from the same point that has always been. This idea of what the church has presented is a whole new, if you're a conservative person, the conservative thing to do is you don't change. You do not just run off and do it. You're conservative. You are measured in what you do. And if you're a conservative person, you stay with Torah because that's what it was. It would be a liberal thing to do to eliminate Torah. But that's what the church is teaching us they've done. So it is not the conservative thing to hold on to the teachings of the church and the teachings that the church is telling you that Paul teaches, and that Yahushua teaches, that the Torah is no longer applicable and no longer to be a part of our lives. You know, when they start teaching this, and that's what you've grown up in, and you're being challenged to rethink your thoughts, it is not the conservative thing to do to stay with the messaging of the church. It will feel like it's the conservative thing to do because it's you staying where you'd been taught and you not moving off of that easily. But when you realize that the messaging of the church is a very liberal thing to have done with the messaging of Torah, with the role of Torah in the life of a believer, the conservative thing to do would have been to retain Torah, to continue to operate in Torah. It's the liberal thing and the significant change that the church has entered into in their teachings, entered into the doctrines of, of the church, of the ecclesia, of the called out ones. All right.
Therefore, when we read Paul, if it sounds as though he is doing away with the Torah, we need to reconsider his words. Okay? I'm giving you a presupposition that if he is a true apostle, then he must agree with the message of Yeshua, and Yeshua's message is he didn't come to abolish the Torah. If Paul disagrees with Yeshua, he's a false apostle. And by the way, there were those who thought he did, right? The Ebionites, which was a Jewish sect in the early 2nd century, maybe late 1st century, who accepted Yeshua as the true Messiah, but refused to accept Paul, and said Paul's writings were not authoritative. Yes, sure. So I agree with you. And what did Yeshua teach? He didn't teach something new, right? No. He taught exactly what the Torah and the prophets and the writings had said. Good point. All right. Let's now go into Paul a little bit more, okay? This is the one that is often brought up when we have this discussion of law and grace. What does under the Torah mean, or under the law? The phrase under the Torah, and I'm going to use Torah and law interchangeably because it is the word nomos, and that's how it would have been understood by the original readers. It's found 11 times in the Pauline epistles. I'm not going to give them all to you, but I'm going to give some of them. For sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. This is one of the verses that immediately people go to. Look, You're no longer under law, you're under grace. What does it mean? The context of Romans 6. The believer has died and risen with the Messiah, right? Before coming to faith, the Torah or the law condemned the sinner, for the Torah condemns those who are in rebellion against God. Messiah paid the penalty for sin which the Torah requires. Thus, the believer is no longer under the condemnation of the Torah, but now experiences God's grace by which one is both willing and able to live as the Torah teaches. Under Torah in this text clearly means under the condemnation of the Torah. It doesn't say you no longer have any relationship to the Torah. It says you're no longer under the condemnation of it.
Yeah, and that's been my experience also. That is one of the major things that creates confusion, is this idea that under the law is suggestive. And if you're reading from church perspective, again, church teaching perspective, you're receiving under the law as meaning that you are under the yoke of the law, that you're under the constraints of the law. The law is telling you what you need to do and not do, how you order your day, and that is bad. And so the argument of the church teaching is that being under the law, because clearly being under the law is not a positive thing; it's a negative thing in the writings of Paul. And so if you are going to receive being under the law, being under the edict of the law, under the things that the law asks you to do and not do, if you're going to receive and conflate those two things together, that under the law means just being subject to the law, then yeah, you're going to have to come to the conclusion that under the law is bad, and keeping the law, keeping the Torah, keeping the instructions is bad because Paul's teaching against it. But if you know and start from the perspective that Paul is not teaching against Torah, embraces Torah, he himself keeps it. And, if you start from that perspective that there is no transition away from the law, because you have to go find that transition, which I have not found. If you're going to start from the perspective that there was a transition from the law, and that being... I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that. So if you're going to change your perspective away from church teaching back to the teaching that Paul never taught us that the law went away, then you know that when he's talking about being under the law, he must be talking about something else. In much the same way that we get into the discussions about circumcision and uncircumcision in Galatians and some other things. So we would have to reevaluate how we are receiving our understanding of what Paul is saying when he says to those under the law. And it seems when you begin to really think about it, what Tim's offering as an explanation is just it just almost has to be the way. Because as Paul teaches us in Romans, and as Tim's going to do a better job than I can do explaining what is taking place in that letter to the Romans, there is this idea, and we're going to get it in Corinthians, when he says, to those under the law, I became as one under the law. There is this concept, that sin, that the law, the Torah identifies sinful behavior, wrong behavior. It identifies good behavior and identifies wrong behavior. And if you're going to stay in wrong behavior, if you're going to do wrong behavior, you're in violation of Torah, and you are under the condemnation of Torah, because the Torah, the prescribed Torah from Mount Sinai, has repercussion. If you are going to sin, there is a price to pay, and that is the condemnation of the Torah that he's speaking about. And without Messiah, you are under the constant pressure and fear of paying the price yourself for the condemnation that comes with sin. So if you end up cheating somebody and you wish you hadn't, I think you could repent and ask for forgiveness and receive forgiveness in the moment. But then you have this constant battle of this. Every time you make a mistake, you want to go and repent. And it's just constant fear and battle that you are always going to be, the hammer of the condemnation of the law is over your head, and it could come down at any moment. And that is a burden. That is a yoke. That is a struggle when you're living in fear. But once Messiah comes, Once Messiah comes and you become a believer in Messiah, you begin to realize that the condemnation, the death that you would experience, which is also failure to reach the goal, which is the resurrection in the promised land. Because everybody, the hammer over their head is the idea that they're going to lose that. They're going to pay. They're going to die on this earth, and they're not going to get the resurrection. They're not going to get their hope and their place in the world to come, in the New Jerusalem. But with the coming of Messiah, once you understand, once you can come to understand that Messiah came in his first role, one of the roles he came to take up is that of Savior, Redeemer, Deliverer. So he came and he paid the what do you want to call it? The legal price of sin. Sin requires death. It always did. It did from the days of Adam forward. It requires death. Well, he came to pay that death. And if you will follow him and stay with him, you can find your righteousness in him, so that you're not dependent upon your own righteousness. And if you're finding your righteousness in him, you know that he removed the hammer. There is no hammer for those who follow Jesus. Yahushua, there is. He has made your way secure. Now, it is still incumbent upon us to follow Yahushua, because if we continue in our sin, if we continue to turn away from Yahuwah and Yahushua and their commands and their ways, if you continue, what he has done will become of naught for you, just like what he did in the days of the nation of Israel became naught for the majority of Israel, because they just simply did not receive it. And so then they didn't receive it and walk in it. And so then they lost it. And the same thing holds true for the believer in Yahushua. You either receive what he has done, and he's removed that hammer of the condemnation of the law. You receive it, and you take up your cross. You begin to walk according to him and his ways and his commands. And you receive it and you walk forward. And if you will do that, the hammer's gone. But if you will not receive it, if you just want to return back to the mire, if you just want to return back to other ways and do it your ways, then you will slip out and fall out of that, the benefit of what the Messiah has brought. All right, let's go back to Tim.
Okay, another text is Romans 6:14. For sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. The context of... Wait, didn't I just do this? Notice that Paul puts under law as opposite of under grace. This means that one cannot be both under law and under grace. Right? Read it again. For sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law, but you are under grace. Meaning what? If you're under law, you're not under grace, and if you're under grace, you're not under law. Okay? We agree with people who argue that way. When somebody argues with me on that one, say, look, you have to be one or the other. If you're under law, you're not under grace. If you're under grace, you're under law. I say, you're right. Then the next question I ask is this. Were the believers who lived before Yeshua's incarnation under the law? If so, how could they have been saved? God's salvation is by grace alone. Do you understand my argument? If you say that the Old Testament people were under law, then they certainly could not have been under grace. Then how could they have been saved? Salvation is always by God's grace. Thus, under law means under the condemnation of the law, while under grace means that God's grace has freed us from the condemnation of the Torah. For sin shall not be master over you. You are no longer condemned by sin according to the Torah, but you now are under God's grace. You've been forgiven. It makes perfect sense in the context and perfect sense with the meaning of Paul in this passage. Here's another one, 1 Corinthians 9:20. To the Jews I became as a Jew, so that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. We have to kind of pull that one apart, don't we? The context of 1 Corinthians 9. In 8 through 10, the chapters 8 through 10, Paul is emphasizing the need for a believer in Yeshua to willingly forfeit his or her rights or privileges for the sake of one's neighbor. That is, loving one's neighbor as Hashem commands may mean giving up one's own privileges. And Paul explains this by his own experience. He said that he, as an apostle, had the right to demand people to support him.
Just very quickly, Hashem is Hebrew, the name, but it's another approach to, putting the name of Yahweh in all caps, Lord. It's a way to avoid saying the name of Yahweh, and that is common in the Hebrew communities, and he embraces Hashem as a reference to the name. He doesn't really, I don't think he ever tries to say the name like Yahweh and different things of that nature, because he knows he can't. None of us can actually pronounce it correctly. But he's more embraced the idea that it's appropriate to try to avoid saying it at all then, and so you give titles like Hashem, the name, and Lord instead of his name, which I'm just not in 100%. I embrace the idea, because as I read, and since hearing him and speaking the things that he's saying, I have continued to evaluate my newfound, as in the last 4, 5, or 6 years, approach to receiving the messaging that I'd heard about the restored names, that when we see Lord in all caps, it's Yahweh, the tetragrammaton, that is being replaced by that. So over and over again. And as over and over again, we see Lord, which is really his name. But over and over again, I see references to my name. They shall know just references to my name being put on them. And his name is not Hashem. His name is not Lord. His name is Yahweh, that tetragrammaton, and the correct pronunciation of it. So when he's talking about things being in his name and his name placed upon things, he's talking about his literal name and not title. So that's why I kind of embrace it. But I guess I didn't mean to get into all of that. But Tim is using the name Hashem there, or the title Hashem, in place of where you would see Lord in all caps or Yahuwah.
Because Yeshua himself said, the one who labors in the gospel is worthy of support. Okay? He said, I have the right to demand that, but I'm not going to do it because in this context, it might undermine the value of the gospel. So he worked with his own hands. He was willing to give up his own rights to help others come to faith in Yeshua. That's the context. And as I just said, he could be supported, but he gave that up. His primary point then, in the immediate context, is that one must be willing to give up his own rights or privileges in order to establish the priority of the gospel within the community of faith. So here, what does under the Torah mean in this text? It cannot mean having legal Jewish status, as we're being taught by some in the Messianic movement now. For Paul makes it clear that though he was as under the law, he actually was not himself under the law. Does that mean, to the Jews I became as a Jew? To the Jews I became as having legal Jewish status so that I might win the Jews. To those who had legal Jewish status, as though I myself had legal Jewish status, even though I myself did not have Jewish legal status. What? Paul had legal Jewish status. How could he get rid of that? He couldn't get rid of that. He was born a Jew, a Hebrew of Hebrews. Surely Paul had legal Jewish status. To say that under the law means having legal Jewish status. Are you hearing this in any of the teachings on the internet or in commentaries on Galatians? No? Okay, that's fine. But that's what's being said. And it's being said that only those who are under the law are required to keep the law. That is, those who have legal Jewish status are required to keep the law and the rest aren't. Well, that can't be what this means. Paul was willing to do what was necessary to remain a part of the non-Yeshua synagogue community in order to maintain an open door for proclaiming to them the gospel in Yeshua. In other words, Paul said, I have every right to be treated as a true born Jew. I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews, circumcised on the 8th day, of the tribe of Benjamin, so forth and so on. Zealous for the Torah. But how is he being treated by the synagogue of non-believers? He's being treated as a Gentile. He's taking lashes. He was willing to do that in order to remain in the community because he was willing to give up even their seeing him as a true Jew in order that he might continue to give the gospel. Under the Torah, were they under the condemnation of the Torah? 5 times he submitted to lashes administered by that community's leaders in order to remain with them. He says, 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. Because of his association with non-believing synagogue community, he was viewed by others as one with the Jewish community that believed their Jewish status and Torah observance was the means of their righteousness. He was willing to associate with the unbelieving Jews, even though they were under the Torah. He was willing to be viewed by the outsiders as one with the unbelieving Jewish community. He says, to the Jews who are under the Jews, I'm willing to be viewed with them to the Jews who are under the Torah, under the law, I'm willing to be viewed with them as under the law, even though I'm not under the law. What does that mean? I'm willing to be associated with those who are still under the condemnation of the law, even though I'm not under the condemnation of the law. And I'm willing to submit to their authority and take their lashes in order to do that. He was thus viewed by outsiders as under the law, that is, as one with the unbelieving Jewish community who, putting their trust in Jewish status and Torah observance, remained under the condemnation of the law. I think this helps us explain what he says in Galatians. If I still am teaching circumcision, why am I being persecuted? Why would he have been accused of still teaching the same thing that the unbelieving synagogue was teaching? Because he was associating with them, and he was part of their community, and he was willing to do that for the sake of the gospel. Yet Paul makes it clear that in reality he was not under the Torah, that is, not under the condemnation of the Torah, for in truth his righteousness was in Yeshua, not in himself. I know that's a difficult text. I'm going to give you, any of you that want this these slides, you can work through that yourself. I also have a paper on the website on this which goes into it in much more depth. Let's take another one, Galatians 3:23. Before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law, being shut up to the faith which was later to be revealed. Under the law in Galatians 3:23, Paul uses the phrase 4 times in Galatians. In this first occurrence, kept in custody under the law, or Torah, means that the Torah, revealing the need to be righteous before God, guarded, Greek word phureo, the unbelieving Israelite by maintaining the heavy weight of condemnation for any who sought righteousness apart from the God of Israel. In other words, why didn't some Israelites just say, okay, I'm out of here. I'm done with this whole thing? Probably some of them did. But they had been trained from the time they were small that if you don't cling to the God of Israel, you'll be condemned. The very condemning nature of the Torah was a fence that kept them in. And that's what custodian means, actually. It means a pedagogue. As such, the Torah guarded or hedged in the Israelite, for it constantly pointed to Messiah, the one who alone would give the full and perfect revelation of Israel's God. When faith was granted, the unbeliever's eyes were opened to see the Messiah in the Torah, who has always been the object of true saving faith and the only true way to gain righteous standing before the Almighty. Even though the Messiah was and is veiled to the person who reads without the illuminating presence of the Ruach, the idea that Jewish identity, linked as it was to the observance of Torah, was considered the means of righteousness before God, this misconception still kept Israel tied to the Torah, which has its ultimate goal to reveal the true Messiah. Do you understand what I mean by that? It's difficult, I recognize, but stay with me on this. When when they began to think that keeping the Torah kept them righteous, was that true? That keeping the Torah made them righteous? No. But what did that untruth do? It tied them to the Torah. And when they're tied to the Torah, what is the Torah leading them to? Messiah.
You know, I don't know that. Maybe you just were able to follow that. Whoever, maybe the watcher and listener was able to follow that quickly, but that is profoundly important to understand what was taking place in all of the writings of Paul. That is profoundly important. So if, revisiting what he has said to make sure you are following what he says, because if you are finding your idea of righteousness and your you think you're going to have right standing before Yahweh because you do or don't follow the Torah is a misunderstanding, because always what he's saying, Torah, everything about Torah is leading you back to the Messiah pre and post his actual coming the first time, because really everybody stands condemned before Yahweh and everybody needs a savior. And you can turn and repent and do this over and over again and maybe get there on your own, but it's obviously an impossibility and it's a burden to bear. But the righteousness, even identified in the old writings, the true righteousness that's going to be received by the Father, by Yahweh, will always be found in identifying and receiving and following the Redeemer, the Savior, the Messiah, pre and post his first coming.
But why did they cling to the Torah? Because they knew if they didn't, in their theology, they were going to be condemned. The condemning voice of the Torah made it too fearful for them to leave it. So that the Torah continued to point them more and more and more towards the Messiah. That, I believe, is what Paul is saying. Moreover, motivated by fear of the condemnation which the Torah announced, Israel was and is constantly compelled to seek God in truth. There are people today who deny Yeshua who are still looking to the Torah to find out what God wants them to do. And all the time that Torah is pointing to the Messiah. In this way, then, the Torah acts as a guardian or a custodian, leaving Israel only one choice: accept Israel's God and his way of righteousness by faith, or face condemnation by the Almighty. Once again, from this perspective, the phrase under the law or Torah can be understood to mean under the condemnation of the law or Torah, applied to those who reject God's saving grace, centered ultimately in Yeshua. One more text in Galatians 4:4-5. But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. There's our phrase again. So that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. Now, when you first look at it, it sounds like, Yeshua born under the law means born as a Jew. To redeem those who were born in the law, that is, to redeem the Jews.
Oh, and I just want to, he may address this, I'm not sure, I can't remember, but I just want to comment to this, when we get into Galatians 4:4-5, that when the fullness of time came, when the time came forth for the first advent of the Son, he was born of a woman, born under the law. He was born under the law as Israel knew it, which included the condemnation of the law, that he might redeem those who were under the law, under the condemnation of the law. So he came born under the law so that he could walk it out and redeem those who are under the condemnation of the law and move us away from that fear of the condemnation of the law, so that we might receive the adoption as sons. And this is one of my points that I am trying to make in my various videos, is that this adoption as sons is really in time. This is post condemnation under the law, post having received Messiah, but the result of which is adoption as sons. Adoption as sons as a Gentile into the nation of Israel, that we might receive that adoption as sons, both now in the Messianic age. Previous, if you were part of the mixed multitudes who joined Israel in the past, but certainly part of the adoption as we're going to see it culminate and manifest at his second coming.
We must read this text in the larger context of Galatians. Here in chapter 4, Paul is reiterating something he has already emphasized in the previous chapter. And I want to give you a chart to kind of see how this works. Having become a curse for us, he says in chapter 3, in chapter 4, born under the Torah. Messiah redeemed us from the curse of the Torah in chapter 3, and in chapter 4, which we just read, in order that he might redeem those under the Torah. In order that we might receive the promise of the Spirit is reiterated in chapter 4, in order that we might receive the Spirit of adoption. Do you see the close connections? If this close connection works, then what does that he might redeem those under the Torah mean if it's paralleled from 4 into chapter 3? Messiah redeemed us from the curse of the Torah. Once again, what do we see? That under the Torah means under the condemnation of the law or the Torah. But was Yeshua born under the condemnation of the Torah? I heard an answer. What? Did I? Yes. Since he is perfect and sinless, he surely was not born under the condemnation of the Torah as pertained to himself. Since he was born of the Virgin Mary, he likewise did not receive the imputed guilt of Adam. So how was it that he was born under the curse of the Torah? He was not born under the condemnation of the law as pertained to himself, but he was born for the purpose of bearing the condemnation of his people. He was born under the condemnation of the law as pertained to those he would save, for by his death he was the sin offering, bearing the guilt of his people. He who knew no sin became a sin offering for us. He became accursed for us. He was born under the curse of the law for that purpose. Galatians 4:21. Tell me, you who want to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? Again, there are those who are telling us this means you who want to convert to Judaism, who want to have legal Jewish status, but in the context it can't mean that. Here Paul addresses the Gentile believers in Galatia who are being persuaded by some Jewish teachers that genuine membership in God's covenant family applies only to those who have legal Jewish status. For a Gentile to attain legal Jewish status meant taking the full yoke of the traditions of the elders upon oneself, completing the man-made rituals of conversion, which consisted of circumcision for males, offering a sacrifice, and ending with a mikveh. For the Gentiles who were being persuaded to convert as a means of gaining righteousness before God, under the Torah meant obtaining legal Jewish status, more than likely. For Paul, however, relying upon one's legal Jewish status for a righteous standing before God was actually to put oneself in bondage to sin and thus, in God's eyes, to remain under the curse of the law. One more. Sticking with me? Okay. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. What does that mean? The influencers were telling the Gentiles that only those with a legal Jewish status could ever be considered righteous before God. But Paul, like Peter, recognized that the indwelling Spirit of God, Ruach HaKodesh, is the true seal of a person's right standing with God. How do you know for sure that someone's saved? Those who are led by the Spirit, they are the sons of God. That's what Paul says. The Spirit bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. Have you had that experience? I'm not talking about some out-of-this-world phenomenal experience. I'm talking about the ongoing, abiding presence of the Spirit of God who reminds us, consoles us, comforts us, convicts us, takes us to the Word, and lets the Word be a balm to our fears, lets the Word encourage us and build us up, takes all of that, and we say, yes, I have an ongoing relationship with the Spirit of God. What was the proof positive to Peter that the Gentiles had been genuinely saved? Because they evidenced the presence of the Spirit of God. And he said, if they receive the Spirit, they certainly have been received by God, and we should receive them too. If the Spirit is pleased to dwell within a person, then surely that person has been accepted by the Father. Thus, for a person to be led by the Spirit means that he or she is no longer under the condemnation of the Torah. He's trying to get the Galatians to see this because earlier on in the Epistle of Galatians he said, You yourselves know that the evidence of the Spirit was true within your midst. How could you be taken away from that? So what does Paul mean by under the Torah? Under the Torah is the opposite of being under grace. Under the Torah or under the law means under God's wrath and thus under the condemnation of the law. Under the law does not mean no longer needing to obey the Torah or that somehow the law or Torah has been abolished. For those who are in Messiah, what has been abolished is the condemnation for sin, which the Torah requires, for Yeshua was condemned in our place. The curse that the Torah demands of us was taken by him. Now I can come to the Torah and not concern myself with being condemned by it. I don't have to try to keep it in order to escape condemnation. My motive for keeping the Torah is new, is different. Paul therefore affirms the message of his master who sent him. The Torah was not abolished by Yeshua. The condemnation of the Torah is abolished for all who are in the Messiah. Those who are true, those with true saving faith, establish the Torah. They don't neglect it. Yeshua condemned sin in the flesh so that the requirement of the Torah might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. What does it mean to walk according to the flesh? What does it mean to walk according to the flesh? According to your own desires, okay? Yeah, according to what you think is right. And what would that have been for a Jewish person raised within the context of a Pharisaic, understanding? It would have been that if I do all these things and remain a good Pharisee, I'm righteous. We don't need to walk according to the flesh. God's given us a pure way to walk, which is not by fear, but by faith. Faith takes away fear, right? So I believe that under the Torah throughout Paul's epistles can be understood primarily to mean under the condemnation of the Torah. Therefore, it doesn't mean that Torah has been abolished or that somehow Torah has put at an opposite to grace. Grace and not under the Torah are cousins, are sister and brother, are lovers, because it's by God's grace that we no longer are under the condemnation of the Torah. Let me give you one more illustration that kind of works for me. This is a man's illustration. Sorry, gals, but I think you'll be able to get it. For about 10 years, I had my own print shop. I had a printing press that weighed 12,000 pounds, 6 ton. It was quite an ordeal getting that into my shop and having it leveled and everything. And it had to be absolutely leveled because the one main cylinder was at least a half a ton or maybe a ton weight itself. Now, this press would run at 7,200 revolutions an hour. That's pretty fast for something that heavy. And as the person I hired to come and set it all up and make sure everything was running right, as he was getting things set up, there were guards on the press. And anybody that's worked in a print shop know that though the manufacturer is required to put the guards on, everybody runs without them because they're in your way. You can't do your work very well. So I asked him, I said, I plan to run those without the guards. What do you think? He held up his hand. He had one finger, a stub of a finger, and 2 fingers were taken off. He said, I just want you to know, yes, you'll probably need to run this without the guards on. But he said, I lost my fingers in a press just like this. I was fortunate. I had my hand on the stop button. If you get your hand in this press when it's running full speed, it won't stop until it gets to your neck. It won't jam until it gets to your neck. And it will kill you. I said, well, thanks for telling me that. And so we got the press all leveled, everything was ready, and I went over it with a fine-tooth comb to make sure I understood all of the mechanisms. And it had a button on it that let you inch. That means turn the cylinders just a little at a time so that you could wash the cylinders between each job. And the inch button and the run button were right next to each other. And I can remember the first time that I put my finger on the inch button and started wiping down the cylinders. Move it, wipe it down. Move it, wipe it down. I thought, if I hit the wrong button, I'm dead. And a fear went into me, like, what am I doing? Why am I running this machine? This is stupid. And I looked at this machine and I thought, this thing could kill me. What have I done? And I got used to this machine, and this machine was the best machine we had. It would print so precisely, it would print so well. It was our money maker. It ran and ran and ran and never gave us a lot of trouble, and it was perfect. And after a while, I looked at that machine and I admired that machine. I had lost my fear of it because I had learned to abide by its rules. I knew that it was okay to work with a machine, and I admired it. I lost my fear. Why? Because I had understood and come underneath its rules. What to do and what not to do, when to do it and when not to do it. In the same way, if we look at God as one who can condemn and with a moment take us for eternity from His presence, we could fear Him and say, I don't ever want to get close to you. You're a consuming fire. Why would I ever want to cuddle up with a consuming fire? And we could look at the Torah and we could say, oh, how could I ever do this? How could I ever keep it? How could I ever gain His favor? And the Spirit comes to us and says, you can never gain His favor. You need somebody who's perfect to gain His favor. And I know just who it is. It's Yeshua. And He died so that the wrath of God would be taken away. So that you no longer need to look at Him as a fearful judge, but you can look at Him as Abba, Father. And then when that change of relationship comes, you say to Him, Father, what do you want me to do? And He says, here, it's good for you. It'll give you joy. It will work for you. It'll work in your business. It'll work in your family. It'll work in your society. It'll work in your city. It will work everywhere. Go ahead. It won't hurt you. It's pure. It's clean. It's made just for you. No fear. The condemnation is gone. The loving hand of the Father now gives to us, and we respond back to Him through the Spirit with that same love. There's no separation between God's Torah and His grace. In fact, it is God's grace who gives us His Torah.
Okay, well, I just want to thank you, Tim. I think that is an excellent, all three parts, but certainly this last part is so helpful. Second part too, but this third part was my favorite. And I just really appreciate your work. You make it very clear. Your presentation is, I think, clear. Maybe folks need to become a little more familiar with the terminology and such to actually follow it more easily. And you can only get that with time, I suppose. But I thought it was an excellent presentation, and I just thank you, Tim. And maybe Baruch.